It was supposed to be just another Thursday. Kids waking up, grabbing their backpacks, heading to school, teachers preparing their lessons, a security guard clocking in for another ordinary shift, parents dropping their children off at the gate, not thinking twice, because why would they? It was just school. It was supposed to be safe. But on April 30th, 2026, in Tacoma, Washington, nothing about that day would be ordinary. At exactly 1:38 in the afternoon, emergency dispatchers across Tacoma received a call that stopped everything. NBC News broke the alert first, then ABC 7, then the Associated Press. 3 words that sent shockwaves across the entire country. Washington State school stabbing. Within minutes, police cars were racing through the streets of Tacoma. Ambulances were speeding toward a hot school. Fire trucks were right behind them. Parents were grabbing their phones, their hearts bounding, desperately trying to reach their children. Inside Foss High School, a place where students were supposed to be learning, laughing, living their teenage years, 6 people were now bleeding. 4 students were in critical condition. A security guard who had simply shown up to do his job was among the wounded. And the suspect, also a student, a teenager. Someone who walked those same hallways every single day. Who was this suspect? Why did this happen? What took place inside those school walls in the moments before everything fell apart? And what does this horrifying incident tell us about the state of school safety in America today? Stay with me, because this story is only just beginning. To understand what happened at Foss High School, you first need to understand the city where it happened. Tacoma is Washington State's 3rd largest city, sitting on the southern end of Puget Sound, just 30 miles south of Seattle. It is a city of contrasts, beautiful waterfront views, a rich history, a diverse population, and like many American cities of its size, deep economic inequality running just beneath the surface. Tacoma is a working-class city at its core. It has its proud neighborhoods and its struggling ones. It has families who have lived there for generations and new communities still finding their footing. Foss High School sits within the Tacoma Public Schools District, one of the largest school districts in Washington State, serving tens of thousands of students across dozens of schools. Foss is a public high school, the kind of school where you find every kind of student. Kids from wealthy families, kids from households where money is tight, kids who are thriving academically, kids who are barely holding on, athletes, artists, scholars, dreamers, all of them sharing the same hallways, the same classrooms, the same cafeteria. Like every public high school in America, Foss had a security presence. Security guards stationed throughout the building, there to make sure students were safe, to de-escalate conflicts before they got out of hand, to be the first line of protection if something went wrong. Nobody expected something to go as wrong as it did on April 30th. That morning, the school had opened like any other day. Students filed in through the front doors. Teachers stood at their classroom thresholds greeting kids. The attendance system logged who was present and who was absent. The cafeteria staff prepared lunch. The security staff took their positions. There was nothing, no warning, no sign, no alarm that suggested what was coming. By the time the afternoon sun began its slow descent toward Puget Sound, Foss High School would be surrounded by police tape flooded with emergency responders, and broadcast on every major news network in the United States. At approximately 1:30 in the afternoon, something occurred inside Foss High School. An altercation, a confrontation, a moment that escalated beyond anything anyone could have stopped in time. Tacoma Police Department spokesperson Officer Shelby Boyd later stood before cameras and microphones and described it simply. The call indicated there was some type of an altercation, a stabbing that occurred at the school. Simple words, but behind those words was chaos. Within the school, the situation unfolded with terrifying speed. A weapon appeared. People were cut. People were stabbed. Students who had been sitting in hallways or walking between classes suddenly found themselves in the middle of something they had no framework to understand. Teachers heard sounds they had never heard inside a school before. The security guard, a civilian employee whose job was to keep these students safe, moved toward the danger instead of away from it. That decision would cost him. By the time school staff were able to begin containing the situation, 6 people had been injured. 5 of them were students. 1 of them was that security guard. All of them were bleeding. All of them needed immediate medical attention. The school's emergency protocols activated. Staff began moving students away from the area. Classrooms were locked, announcements were made, and someone, a teacher, an administrator, a student with a phone, called 911. At 1:38 p.m., the Tacoma Fire Department received the call. Possible stabbing, Foss High School, multiple victims. The city of Tacoma mobilized instantly. When the first responders arrived at Foss High School, they found a scene that no emergency worker ever wants to find at a place where children are supposed to be safe. Tacoma Fire Department spokesperson Chelsea Shepard described what her crews encountered when they arrived on scene. 5 patients needed immediate treatment and transport. Of those 5, 4 were in critical condition, meaning their injuries were severe enough to be life-threatening. 1 patient had minor injuries by comparison. All 5 were loaded into ambulances and transported to area hospitals with urgency. The 6th injured person, the suspect, was also taken to a hospital, but under police custody. Even in injury, there was no freedom for the person responsible for what had happened. Officer Shelby Boyd of the Tacoma Police Department addressed reporters who had gathered outside the school perimeter, their cameras rolling, their microphones thrust forward. She confirmed the basics. 4 students and 1 adult security officer had been transported to local hospitals. The suspect, also a student, was injured and in custody. She was careful in her wording, as law enforcement always is in the immediate aftermath of an incident. I don't know how many were stabbed, if there were lacerations compared to abrasions, Boyd said honestly, acknowledging that in those first frantic hours, the full picture was still coming into focus. What was clear was the severity. 4 patients in critical condition is not a minor incident. For young people, teenagers, students, kids who had come to school that morning with nothing more threatening on their minds than homework and lunch plans, were now fighting for their lives in Tacoma hospital beds. Inside the school, police officers moved methodically through the building, securing it room by room, making sure there were no additional threats, no additional victims, nothing that had been missed in the initial chaos. The building had to be declared safe before any further decisions could be made about the students still inside. Outside, the perimeter was established. Patrol cars blocked the surrounding streets. Officers directed traffic and kept onlookers back. News vans began arriving, their satellite dishes rising into the Tacoma sky. And somewhere in that building, or being loaded into an ambulance, were teenagers whose lives had just been changed forever in ways none of them had chosen. The moment the situation was reported, Foss High School went into full lockdown. This is a term that has become far too familiar in American schools. Lockdown, a word that means stay in your room, lock the door, turn off the lights, hide, be quiet, and pray that whatever is happening in the hallway does not find you. American students have practiced lockdown drills since they were small children. They know what to do because they have been taught what to do, and the fact that they have been taught what to do says everything about the world they are growing up in. At 1:38 p.m., as the fire department was being called, the school went into lockdown. Students who were in classrooms stayed in classrooms. Students who were in hallways were rushed into the nearest room. Doors were locked. Blinds were pulled. Teachers stood between their students and whatever lay outside. The psychological weight of a school lockdown cannot be overstated. Even in drills, children feel fear. In a real lockdown, with real sirens wailing outside, with real police officers surrounding the building, with real uncertainty about what is happening and to whom, the experience is traumatic in ways that do not simply disappear when the all-clear is given. These students, the ones huddled in dark classrooms, phones in hand, texting their parents, "I'm okay, I'm locked in, I don't know what's happening," they will carry this day with them. Some of them will recover quickly, others will struggle for months or years. Some may never feel entirely safe in a school building again. Parents, meanwhile, were receiving notifications, either through the school's automated alert system, or through their children's frantic text messages, or through the news breaking on their phones and televisions. Parents in Tacoma began to learn that something had happened at Foss High School, and they came. Of course they came. They drove too fast and parked wherever they could and ran toward the school because that is what parents do when their children might be in danger. Police and school staff had to manage a growing crowd of frightened adults outside the perimeter, desperate for information, desperate to see their children, desperate for someone to tell them that everything was going to be okay. A reunification area was established near the school, a designated location where students who had been safely evacuated or dismissed could be reunited with their parents. It is a procedure that emergency planners design ahead of time, hoping they will never need to use it, knowing that someday they might. At 2:45 p.m., just over an hour after the lockdown began, the remaining students were safely dismissed. They walked out of the building into the afternoon light, some crying, some silent, some clutching their friends. All of them carrying something they had not carried when they walked in that morning. Let us talk about the people who were hurt. Because in stories like this, it is easy for numbers to replace human beings. It is easy to say 6 injured and move on to the next fact. But behind every number is a person. A real person with a name, a family, a future. 4 students were transported to local hospitals in critical condition. For teenagers, for young people who woke up that morning, got dressed, maybe argued with a sibling over the bathroom, maybe grabbed breakfast, maybe scrolled through their phones on the bus ride to school. Normal morning things, the kinds of things you do when you assume the day ahead is going to be normal. They did not assume they would end that day in a hospital bed by late afternoon. There was at least some relief. All 4 critical patients had stabilized. Their conditions improved from critical to stable, which in medical terms means the immediate threat to their lives had passed, whether they faced surgeries, long recoveries, permanent physical effects. Those details were not yet known publicly, but they were alive. And in a situation like this, alive is everything. The 5th student victim, the one with minor injuries, was also treated and taken to the hospital. Minor injuries in a stabbing incident still means a person was cut with a weapon. Minor is relative. The physical wounds may heal faster. The psychological ones may take much longer. And then there is the security guard. This person, an adult, a professional, someone employed specifically to protect students, was injured while doing exactly that. We do not know exactly what role the security guard played in the moments of the attack. We do not know if they intervened, if they tried to stop the suspect, if they were simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. What we know is that they were there, they were doing their job, and they paid a physical price for it. Security guards at American schools are often underpaid, undertrained for extreme situations, and underappreciated. Until something like this happens, they are the first human barrier between students and danger. They are not police officers. They do not carry weapons in most schools. They rely on presence, communication, and courage. On April 30th at Foss High School, that courage was tested in the most brutal way possible. Now we come to the question that everyone was asking. The question that lingered in the air outside Foss High School as the news cameras rolled and the parents clutched their children and the police officers wrote their reports. Who did this? The answer, when it came, was both simple and devastating. A student. The suspect was a student at Foss High School, not an outsider. Not someone who had broken in from the outside world. Someone who was already inside, already part of the school community, already walking those hallways every day, already sitting in those classrooms, already eating in that cafeteria. Because the suspect is a juvenile, the legal term for a person under the age of 18, their identity has been protected. This is standard legal procedure in the United States. When a minor is arrested or charged with a crime, their name is generally withheld from public reporting. This exists to protect the rights of young people within the legal system and to acknowledge that juveniles are not fully developed adults, that their brains are still forming, that rehabilitation is still a possibility in ways it may not be for older offenders. The suspect was booked on 5 counts of first-degree assault. In Washington state, first-degree assault is a serious felony charge. It involves intentionally causing great bodily harm to another person, or doing so with the use of a deadly weapon. 5 counts means 5 separate people were allegedly assaulted by this individual during the incident. 5 counts. 5 people whose lives were altered in a matter of minutes. The suspect was also injured during the altercation. Officer Boyd confirmed that the 6th injured person, the one taken to the hospital in police custody, was the suspect themselves. How exactly the suspect was injured is not entirely clear from public reporting. Whether they were injured in a struggle with the security guard or in some other way during the chaos of the incident has not been specified. What does this tell us about the suspect? It tells us very little, actually, and that is perhaps the most unsettling part. We do not know what drove this teenager to bring a weapon to school and use it against fellow students and a security guard. We do not know if there was a specific conflict, a fight that had been building, a rivalry that had escalated, a moment of rage that overflowed. We do not know if there were mental health issues, if there was trauma at home, if there were warning signs that were missed or ignored or never seen at all. These are the questions that investigators will spend weeks and months trying to answer. These are the questions that psychologists, social workers, school counselors, and the courts will all grapple with as this case moves forward. But here, on the day it happened, the answers were not available. What was available was a charge sheet, 5 counts of first-degree assault, a juvenile in a hospital bed under police guard, and a school full of traumatized students and staff trying to make sense of something that made no sense at all. Tacoma Public Schools issued a statement in the aftermath of the attack. In it, the district acknowledged what had happened, offered support to those affected, and outlined its immediate response. The school is secure, and we are currently investigating, Officer Boyd had told reporters, indicating that law enforcement and school administration were working in close coordination. The district announced that school and after-school activities for Friday, the day after the attack, were canceled. This was not surprising. The school had just been the scene of a violent crime. Students and staff needed time. The building itself may have needed to be processed further by law enforcement. And frankly, no one was in a condition to pretend that a normal school day could simply happen 24 hours after what had just occurred. The school would reopen on Monday, the district said, but it would not reopen empty-handed. Counselors would be on site, professional mental health counselors available to speak with any student or staff member who needed support. This is standard crisis protocol in American schools. And it is important. What happens in the days and weeks after a traumatic event often determines the long-term psychological outcomes for those who experienced it. The district's statement included words of gratitude that stood out as significant. We are grateful for the quick, calm action of our staff and our first responders. Quick and calm. In the middle of a stabbing attack inside a school building, the staff of Foss High School responded with quickness and calm. That is not nothing. That is, in fact, extraordinary. Teachers who had trained for emergencies but never expected to face one. Administrators who had to make rapid decisions with incomplete information. A security guard who faced the threat directly. All of them, in their own way, acting to protect students. Their actions may well have saved lives. By Thursday evening, the story of the Foss High School stabbing had gone fully national. NBC News covered it. ABC 7 covered it. The Associated Press, whose reporting reaches hundreds of news outlets around the world, covered it. Local Washington outlets like King TV and others had reporters on the ground outside the school before the lockdown had even been fully lifted. And with national coverage came national reaction. Because this is America in 2026, a country where school violence has become so tragically common that there is now an entire infrastructure built around it. Crisis response protocols, active shooter and weapon attack drills, mental health counseling teams, school resource officers, metal detectors. And still, incidents like this one keep happening. The conversation that follows events like Foss High School is always the same, and it is always exhausting. And it is always necessary. What more can be done? What systems failed? What could have been caught earlier? Were there warning signs? Was this preventable? These are not simple questions with simple answers. School violence in America is the product of many intersecting forces: mental health crises, social isolation, bullying, family instability, easy access to weapons. The psychological weight of growing up in a culture saturated with violence and uncertainty. There is no single solution because there is no single cause. What there is, always, is the human toll, the 4 students who were rushed to the hospital in critical condition, the security guard who was injured doing their job, the hundreds of other students who were locked in dark classrooms for over an hour, terrified, the parents who raced to the school, hearts in their throats, the teachers who put themselves between their students and the unknown. These are the real numbers, not the statistics. The people. In the days and weeks that follow the Foss High School stabbing, a number of processes will unfold simultaneously. Each of them matters. Each of them will shape what comes next, for the victims, for the suspect, for the school, and for the broader community. For the 4 students who were hospitalized in critical condition, the immediate priority is physical. Recovery. Medical teams will assess the extent of their injuries and determine what treatment is needed. Some may require surgery, some may face long recoveries. All of them will need psychological support alongside the physical, because trauma does not stay in the body, it lives in the mind, in the memory, in the way a person flinches at a sudden sound or feels unsafe in a crowded room. For the security guard, similar questions apply. Physical healing, yes, but also the psychological processing of having been attacked while doing one's job. That is a particular kind of trauma. The kind that makes a person question whether they can go back to work, whether they can face another school day, whether the risk is worth it. For the hundreds of students who were present that day, who did not directly witness the attack but who experienced the lockdown, the fear, the uncertainty, trauma counseling will be essential. The school's decision to have counselors on site when it reopens is the right one. Research consistently shows that early intervention in the aftermath of traumatic events leads to better long-term outcomes. Students who are given space to process what they experienced, who are told that their feelings are valid, who are connected with professional support, fare better than those who are simply expected to return to normal. For the suspect, the juvenile student who is now facing 5 counts of first-degree assault, the legal process will move forward. Juvenile cases in Washington state are handled differently from adult cases. The juvenile justice system is designed, at least in theory, with rehabilitation in mind. Depending on the severity of the charges and the circumstances of the case, the suspect could face a range of outcomes, from probation and mandatory counseling to confinement in a juvenile facility. Their age, mental health status, prior record if any, and the specifics of what occurred will all factor into what the courts decide. For Tacoma Public Schools and for Foss High School specifically, there will be an internal review. What security measures were in place? Were they adequate? What could be improved? Were there any warning signs about the suspect that were missed? These are questions that school administrators, the school board, and potentially state education officials will be asking in the coming weeks. There is a question underneath all of this that never fully gets answered in the immediate aftermath of events like this one, a question that is harder than the legal questions, harder than the policy questions, harder even than the medical questions. How does a child end up here? How does a teenager, a young person who should be consumed with homework and friendships and figuring out who they want to be, how did they end up bringing a weapon to school and using it against the people around them? This is not a question with a comfortable answer. It is not even a question with a single answer. Every case is different. Every individual is shaped by a unique combination of factors: biological, psychological, social, environmental. What breaks one person would not break another. What one person survives without visible scars leaves another permanently damaged. But there are patterns. Researchers who study school violence have identified certain common threads. Social isolation, the feeling of being invisible, excluded, or actively rejected by peers, appears frequently in the histories of young people who commit acts of violence. Mental health struggles that go unaddressed, either because the young person does not seek help, or because the help is not available, or because the adults around them do not recognize the signs. Family instability, divorce, poverty, abuse, neglect, that leaves a child without the secure base they need to develop healthy coping mechanisms. None of these factors are excuses. None of them eliminate personal responsibility. A person makes choices, and those choices have consequences, and the 5 people injured at Foss High School did not deserve what happened to them regardless of what drove the suspect to do it. But understanding why these things happen is the only path toward preventing them. If we treat every act of school violence as simply an evil event, something that came from nowhere and could not have been seen coming, then we learn nothing. We change nothing, and we sentence ourselves to watching it happen again and again. If, instead, we ask the uncomfortable questions: what was this student's life like? What pressures were they under? What did their school days look like? Was there anyone paying attention? Was there anyone who could have intervened? Then at least we have a chance of doing something differently. Tacoma is a city that knows hardship. It is a city with a working-class backbone, a city that has faced economic struggles, a city where people have had to be resilient through difficulties that many more comfortable communities never face. But it is also a city with community, a city where people show up for each other. In the hours after the Foss High School stabbing, that community showed up. Parents who had spent terrifying hours waiting for word of their children held those children tight when they finally reunited. Teachers who had spent the afternoon protecting their students processed their own fear once the school day officially ended. Community members reached out to each other through social media and neighborhood networks, checking in, offering support, sharing information. Local officials responded. Law enforcement held press briefings to keep the public informed, while protecting the integrity of the ongoing investigation. School district officials communicated with parents directly. Mental health resources were mobilized. This is what communities do. They absorb the shock of something terrible and then they begin, slowly and painfully, the work of recovery. Recovery does not mean forgetting. It does not mean pretending the thing did not happen or that it did not matter. Recovery means carrying what happened forward in a way that does not destroy you. It means finding a way to feel safe again, even if a part of you knows that safety can never be completely guaranteed. It means, for the students of Foss High School, finding a way to walk back through those doors on Monday morning. That takes courage. Enormous. Quiet, unrecognized courage. The Foss High School stabbing did not occur in a vacuum. It occurred in a country that has been grappling with the epidemic of school violence for decades. The United States has more incidents of school violence than any other developed nation in the world. This is a statistical fact, not an opinion, not a political statement. It is documented, studied, and deeply troubling. In recent years, much of the focus in American school safety discussions has centered on gun violence, and rightly so, given the devastating mass shooting incidents that have become distressingly common. But weapon attacks involving knives and other bladed weapons are also a significant and often underreported part of the picture. Knife attacks can be just as deadly as gun attacks, particularly in confined spaces like school hallways. Schools across the country have implemented various safety measures in response to this ongoing crisis. Metal detectors at entrances, clear backpack policies, visitor screening systems, increased security guard presence, school resource officers, sworn law enforcement personnel stationed full-time in schools, anonymous tip lines where students can report concerns about classmates, social-emotional learning programs designed to build communication and conflict resolution skills. All of these measures help. None of them are sufficient on their own. Because the truth is that no security measure can fully protect against a determined person who is already inside the building. When the threat is external, someone trying to enter the school, security systems have a chance to intervene. When the threat is already a student, already trusted, already inside, the calculus changes completely. This is why experts consistently emphasize that physical security measures, while important, cannot be the only or even the primary response to school violence. The more fundamental approach, the harder, slower, more expensive approach, is creating school environments where students are known, where their struggles are seen, where help is accessible before desperation becomes violence. Every student who feels genuinely connected to their school community, who has at least one adult who knows their name and notices when they are struggling, is a student less likely to become either a perpetrator or a victim of school violence. The research on this is clear. Building those connections takes resources. It takes trained counselors in sufficient numbers. It takes teachers who are not so overworked and overwhelmed that they cannot notice the student who seems to be retreating. It takes administrators who prioritize climate and culture alongside academics. It takes communities that value their schools enough to fund them properly. These are systemic changes. They are not quick. They are not cheap. But they are the only approach that addresses the root causes rather than just the symptoms. As of the time of this documentary, the investigation into the Foss High School stabbing is ongoing. Law enforcement is piecing together exactly what happened, in what sequence, and why. The legal process for the juvenile suspect is moving forward through the Washington state court system. The victims are recovering physically and beginning the longer process of psychological recovery. The school reopened on Monday with counselors on site. Students who felt ready went back. Some who did not feel ready stayed home a little longer, and that was okay too. The process of returning to normalcy after trauma is not linear. It does not happen on a schedule. It happens at the pace that each individual person can manage. Foss High School will carry this day forward. It becomes part of the school's history, a painful part, an unwanted part, but an inescapable part. future students who never experienced April 30th, 2026, will nonetheless grow up in the shadow of it. The changes made to school security and climate in the aftermath will shape their experience in ways they may never fully know. That is the nature of events like this one. They do not stay in the past. They reach forward into the future, shaping policies and protocols and the way a community thinks about itself and the people who belong to it. For the 4 students who were critically injured and have since stabilized, life goes on, but change. They will have their own timelines of recovery, their own battles, their own victories. They will have days when the memory of what happened is distant, and days when it is as immediate as if it just occurred. For the security guard, the same. For the 5th student victim, the same. For the hundreds of Foss High School students who experienced that lockdown, many of whom were never in physical danger but who were certainly in psychological danger. The road ahead involves learning to trust that school is still a place they can go. That is not a small thing to ask of a young person. And for the suspect, the juvenile student now facing serious criminal charges, the road ahead is uncertain. The legal system will make its determinations, but beyond the legal outcomes, there is a human being at the center of this story too, a young person who made choices that caused tremendous harm, and who will now face the consequences of those choices in a court, in a facility, in their own conscience, for the rest of their life. On April 30th, 2026, at Foss High School in Tacoma, Washington, 6 people were injured in a stabbing attack, 4 students were critically wounded, a security guard was hurt. The suspect, a fellow student, was taken into custody and charged with 5 counts of first-degree assault. These are the facts, clean, clinical, documented, but behind the facts are human beings, people with names and families and futures. People who carried something into that school building that morning that they should never have had to carry. People who walked out of that building, or were carried out, fundamentally different from who they were when the day began. Schools should be safe. That is not a radical idea. It is not a political demand. It is the most basic expectation that any society can have for its children, that the place we send them every day to learn and grow and become who they are going to be is a place where they are protected. We have not yet figured out how to guarantee that, not in America, not in 2026, and that failure, a collective, systemic, ongoing failure, shows up again and again in stories like this one. What we can do, what each of us watching this documentary can do, is refuse to look away, refuse to let these stories become background noise, refuse to accept that this is simply the way things are. The students of Foss High School deserve better. Every student in every school in this country deserves better. That is the story. That is the truth. And it is one that will not let us rest until we find a way to change it. Script based entirely on publicly reported information from NBC News, ABC 7, Associated Press, and Tacoma Police Department official statements. All facts are sourced from verified news reporting dated April 30th, 2026.